U.S. inflation soared in October. The consumer price index climbed 0.9% last month. It marks a 6.2% increase in prices since the same time last year. The Labor Department's latest numbers reveal the largest 12-month increase in inflation over the last 3 decades. The data comes as the Biden administration suggests the cost of inflation should begin decreasing. The president's office released a statement addressing inflation, saying it is high on his agenda. Inflation hurts Americans' pocketbooks, and reversing this trend is a top priority for me. The largest share of the increase in prices in this report is due to rising energy costs, and in the few days since the data for this report were collected, the price of natural gas has fallen. The president's statement comes on the heels of the Labor Department's release of the latest unemployment numbers, which reveal first-time jobless claims have fallen to a new pandemic-era low. 267,000 Americans filed new unemployment claims for the week ending November 6th. That is down 4,000 initial claims from the previous week. This is the 6th consecutive week first-time jobless claims have declined. Diane Swonk is the chief economist at Grant Thornton. She joins me now for more on this. Hi, Diane. Welcome. So, on the one hand, we have this bad news about inflation. On the other hand, we have this good news about employment numbers. So what are we to make of the mix?
Well, it means we've got a hot economy, and that's good. And it's the silver lining is that we're continuing to see improvements in employment. And I actually think we're going to be gaining momentum through the end of the year. But it also moves up the Fed's timeline in terms of what they have to do to combat inflation and deal with the fact that we now have, even as inflation cools in 2022, and I don't think it's going to crest until we get into the early part of 2022, it won't cool enough to be a Goldilocks economy. We're seeing much more broad-based inflation gains, and that move up in shelter costs, really important. We used to measure it differently before 1983. So actually, if we look at this data apples to apples, the kind of inflation that we're seeing right now, that 6.2%, is very similar and could be even higher than as we saw inflation decelerating in 1982. That's really stunning. There's no muscle memory on it. We've not seen anything like this in quite a long time.
Right. And so even though it can be, like you said, signs of a hot economy, meaning it could be a byproduct of high demand, which is a good thing. Certainly for Americans rolling up to the gas pump or wheeling through the grocery store, it doesn't feel like a good thing. So when can everyday Americans expect to see some relief from this continual surge in consumer prices?
Well, sadly, I think we're going to be in this situation for the next 5 to 6 months. And even as inflation comes down, the level of prices will still be high. And in fact, what we've looked at is over 2 years, what has happened to things like prices at the gas pump, which are obviously critical for commute costs, and things like proteins. I mean, the only thing that didn't go up a lot in price in terms of proteins was turkey. So go ahead and buy turkeys for Thanksgiving. Those are the cheapest things out there, but everything else is really expensive. And that's really hard for people who are, trying to deal with rents going up now. And the commute costs for those workers who work in person, which are your lowest wage workers, you've now wiped out 2 years of gains, which have been accelerating at a double-digit rate just because it costs now more to commute. And I think those are very important things that we have to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And as you just mentioned, costs of fuel, oil, energy, all of these things went up last month. But still, the U.S. core CPI was higher than expected. What does that mean, and how does that impact the average American?
Well, that's really what we're watching here, is that even as we see some of the temporary things from reopening a $20 trillion economy all at once and a global economy all at once, we're all trying to run through the door at the same time, there's going to be heat on that reentry and friction. That's what we're seeing out there. But what we're seeing now is some legs, some broadening of the inflation, some spillover of the higher energy prices into transportation costs, but also into the goods that we get at our grocery store and that show up on our shelves everywhere as we go into the holiday season. But we're also starting to see that move up in the core inflation of medical costs. That's something that had been lower because elective surgeries weren't done. There's huge backlogs now to get routine tests. That's one of the places where we've seen people burn out the most, and labor shortages the most acute is in the healthcare industry, and they're raising wages quite rapidly in that industry, but that creates a bit of a vicious cycle, and that's where the Fed is going to have to worry about things, is in that core rate of inflation, not just the overall food and energy, which matters so much to all of us, but the things the Fed can control, those are heating up too hot as well.
Right, and you mentioned employment and the fact that a lot of people are hiring. So first-time unemployment claims obviously are down for the sixth consecutive week, which we mentioned at the top. But of course, you're getting a new job. That's great, but you're also dealing with higher inflation. And we know from the October jobs report that hourly wages are up, which is a good thing. But it seems like today's CPI index reveals that with inflation up 6.2% during the same window, those gains are entirely erased. So my question to you is that going to put added pressure on employers who are still trying to hire and still out there in this competitive and tight labor market to have to continue to raise their wages?
Well, I think just the tight labor market itself, we're likely to see a record-breaking more than 11 million job openings by the end of October. We only have the data through August. We're about to get it for September, but it continued to accelerate. We don't have immigration. That's come to almost fallen off a cliff. We have older workers who've retired, in excess of 3 million workers retired above what the baby boom trend was pre-pandemic. We have to get those workers back. We've got workers that are on the sidelines still because they don't have child care, or they don't have reliable school schedules until we get vaccinations all up to speed and kids don't go back into quarantine. So all of these factors together make it really hard to stop the pressures that employers are facing as well, and most notably small and mid-sized businesses. They're now competing with Amazon, even manufacturers. For the first time in my career, I'm seeing them compete with these retail behemoths that are very tech savvy. They can offset and absorb those price increases of the increases in wages. On the other side of it, many of the small and mid-sized businesses can't, and it's really a testimony to how low many manufacturing wages have actually fallen rather than how high they are. So we have to be careful when we think about what kinds of jobs we're generating as well.
Absolutely. Well, Diane Swonk, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.